so let's see where we're at here. So. Okay, so assignment number 1 is due today. How many people are already finished with assignment number 1? Okay, so for anybody who isn't finished, you'll have a little bit of time tonight, but I wanted to spend the rest of the time that we have working on assignment number 2. This probably doesn't make sense, but just to let you know, there's a new assignment out there. Okay, out of context, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so any questions before we get started? Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder for today. So today's the 3rd. A new folder and then open up brackets. Wind it to today's folder. And let's open up some tabs here. So we know we're going to need HTML shell. I'm going to use lorem ipsum, and then might use W3 schools. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a file new, paste in HTML shell. Save it as ex1.html. Okay, so let's just do a quick example. So let's make a div. And then let's have a paragraph. Of lorem ipsum. Okay, so let's very briefly talk about the CSS Float Property. How many people went over that in one of your classes? Okay, so there's when you're normally creating block level elements, remember we talked about block level elements last week? So quick question, paragraph, is that inline or block level? Block, and then what does that kind of imply? What does that mean? Just in your own language, you don't have to be super technical. What happens after a block tag?
Starts a new line.
You get a new line, perfect. Versus if it's inline, it's like inline, like EM's a good example. The text would be inline. So we've got this block level tag. And what float does is it interrupts the normal flow. Let's see if they have W3 Schools is a more technical definition. I guess they don't. Okay. It basically, let's say for example, we've got this paragraph and it's a block level tag and we want an image to kind of float around it. So this is a good example. See how the image is floating left? Normally, if we had an image in a paragraph, what would happen? They'd be on two separate lines. So like say for example here, if I got rid of this, oops, just get rid of just the float part. See how normally it would be on two lines? But when we float it, it allows the text to wrap around it. So what we're doing is we're saying the image is floating over here and then draw out the text as normal. I don't know a good site. I think if we just do lorem ipsum images, and I guess I can put this in bless you. Okay. I'm going to put this under resources. I'm going to put this to where I think you can just copy and paste it. And let's see if I remove all formatting. And just so we know we're safe and we're always getting a good image, we'll just keep on using this puppy image. How about that? Okay. So what you can do is just copy and paste this into your code. And what we're going to have is an image up here. Source equals. This will just make a 200 by 200 image. Everyone's good? Everyone was able to get to that site okay? Okay. So let's go ahead and inside the head section, let's go ahead and put a style. And then float the image left. Okay, so just so we're good with terminology, when I put the style tag up here, we have three choices of how to include CSS: external, internal, and inline. Which of those three is that? Internal. So make sure you know this terminology. So if I say something like put an internal style sheet, okay, make sure you know. Make sure you don't get that in inline confused. Okay, inline is literally in line with the rest of the HTML. This is an internal style sheet. And there are three different types of selectors. There's an element selector, class selector, and ID selector. Of those three, which is this? Element. And what's the giveaway so that's correct, and then what's the giveaway that it's an element? There's a couple of different correct answers that I'll probably accept. So what do we normally see in front of the name of a class or an ID? Yeah, exactly, the period of the hash symbol. Because there's nothing in front of it, we can just assume that it's an element name. Plus, it should also be kind of obvious because it's an element name. You know, that should kind of be something that sticks out. Okay, that's just kind of review. I'm not going to go too much into it. I just wanted you to stay up with your terminology. That way when I talk about these things, you're not overly confused. So normally we had that flow of where we had a block level tag and then a block level tag, and they were stacked on top of each other. But we can actually interrupt that and say, okay, I want this to kind of float independently of everything else. Now this doesn't by itself demo too well. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and see this div right here. I think I don't want to do this. I don't want to introduce too many topics at the same time. Do this. Go ahead and just copy and paste that paragraph a couple of times, so we get a good sense of what's going on. Okay, so stay within the div. So we've got our image, which is floating left, and then 3 paragraphs. And then this makes it a little bit more clear what's going on, is that we've got our image floating left, and then it's kind of sitting there. It kind of takes up space, not really. It's kind of a unique status. It's like, I like to think of it as literally just like floating in the middle of the page, and then everything else can wrap around it as needed. So if we have something that extends, in this case the text extends further than the height of the image, it kind of returns back to normal document flow, kind of. Now this can cause some problems. So what we often do is this thing called the clear fix hack. Once we're done floating something, what we do is we clear it out. So you'll see this piece of code over and over again. We'll say div style equals clear both. And that clears out the left and right floats. There's a few uses of float, and we'll probably go over a couple in class today besides this. This one to me is the simplest to like conceptually understand. It's like you've got this, in this case, this image, and the text kind of wraps around it. This probably looks familiar, like you've seen this in maybe something like a newspaper. You'll see the image for the article, like a traditional print newspaper. On the web it's a little bit different, but traditional print newspaper, you might have an image and then the text wraps around it. Now a little bit of just CSS trivia, make sure that you know what's going on here. This text is right up against the image. How do you think I could give that image a little bit of breathing room, space it out a little bit? What could I use? What CSS property? Exactly, padding or margin. So if I wanted to do it from the perspective of the image, if I wanted to change the image, which would it be, margin or padding? Actually, I think either would suffice. Personally, I would have used margin, but I think in this case either works. But let's do margin. And let's just do a very large amount. Sorry. So we have to make sure I'm inside the image. There we go. Margin 25 pixels. So that's going to be pretty large, but we're going to scale that back, but we see what's going on. Now, what if we didn't want to have the margin on the top and the left? What could we use instead? There's two different answers. There's one I think that's going to be a little bit simpler for this class. So we can actually, within this margin property, we can specify top, bottom, left, and right individually. Right now what happens is it specifies all four at the same time, but we can specify them individually. I found that a lot of people, okay, just make sure it didn't cut out. Okay. A lot of students have a difficult time memorizing the order. So what we can do instead is that we can say, okay, I want the margin right and the margin bottom to be 25 pixels. I'll accept either. I think in this class I'm going to stick to this because I think it's maybe a little bit more clear for a lot of people. And then you could experiment with the values to what you think is going to work well. We'll just leave it at 25. 25 is pretty large, but just so you can visually see what's going on, it's a good starting number. Okay, that's about I think all I want to do with that example. So any questions with that? Do you want me to scroll to like a piece of code or something if you need to catch up typing? And then let's just do a quick 20-second review. So I just put a big div in here. This is very common. I'll do this. I should have probably used main instead, but I'm just so used to using divs. Main would have probably been more appropriate. And then we put an image in here using this lorem ipsum for images. And a few paragraphs of lorem ipsum text. Now these are all block level tags. So what would normally happen is that would be the image, paragraph, paragraph, paragraph. But because we use this float property, which interrupts the normal document layout and actually floated the image to the left, it made it so that everything kind of wrapped around, all the text wrapped around it. And then we went back and then just did some little extra stuff. Make sure that you're kind of on your toes for the older stuff that we've gone over. Everyone go with that? Okay. Let's start up another here. Another HTML shell. And this time, let's go ahead and use main. So this is going to be where our main content is. And let's be very generic. Divs are very generic. Div is just it just means division. It's like you're not really saying anything about the content. Versus like paragraph or header or footer, those are more specific. Div just means it's just some sort of general division. Okay. And let's give this an ID of, it'll be kind of boring here, div1, and then we'll have another div, well, yeah. So we'll have div1 and div2. And then within the head section, let's go ahead and put style I did this. Whatever. So style within the head section. And for main, let's go ahead and give it a border so we can see what we're working with. It's the bright red so we can see our border. And there's not a whole lot to see because our content is there's nothing really going on there. Instead of div 1 and div 2, let's call it box 1 and box 2. I usually try to avoid, I mean, this is kind of generic, but I usually try to avoid like names like this that are the tag. Change it from div to, you know, some other block level element, and then the name's not going to make any sense, but it's still kind of a box. Okay. So we've got that, and then let's do this. Let's say, let's create a class just called box. Sorry, I'm going to take a little detour here. I'm backing out of this example. So we've got our two divs, and then each are going to be both a part of the same class called box. How about that? That'll make our lives a little bit simpler. Sorry, I try not to change the examples halfway through, but I realized that it was going to make the example a little bit more clear. So it's going to be dot box. Okay, so make sure you have this, so because I had written class. So it's going to be dot box, and that means it's the class box. Remember, if we see the dot in front of it, we know that it's a class selector. And then down here, I'm going to use box. And what we're going to do with box is we're going to give it a fixed width. And let's start off with 300 pixels, see how that works. Now, we generally don't do this. We don't usually do a fixed width height, or I'm sorry, a fixed height. But we're going to do this now just to make our lives a little bit easier. So we're just going to make it a 300 by 300 pixel box. The reason you don't typically specify the height is because what happens is the content will often overflow the height, and it can cause problems. But because we don't really have anything to put in it, let's go ahead and specify the height. Now, specifying the width isn't that uncommon, but specifying the height, usually have to have a good reason to want to do that. Okay. I know I changed it a couple times, so let's just make sure we're all on the same page. So you've got main using the class selector, and we set the border at 5 pixels solid red. And then dot box, meaning that we're going to have some class called box. And the width and height, it's going to be 300 pixels by 300 pixels. And then both of these divs are part of that. So now if we view it, nothing to view. So let's go ahead and give our box a background color. So we'll say this works. Now it's not super clear, but this is actually two boxes. If we wanted to, we could even give this its own little border. 1 pixel solid, what's going to show up well? Let's say green maybe. Makes it a little bit more clear what's going on, that we actually have two boxes here. So nothing should be too surprising here because we've got our main, and because main is block level, it's going to take up all the way to the edge of the page. So even though our content, the width isn't as wide as this, it's still going to take up as much as it's going. You know, does that make sense? Because it's block level, so nothing could be kind of in this area. And because our divs are block level, but they're fixed width, it only takes up as much as it needs. Had I done this, so don't change your code, but had I not made it fixed width, if I had just let it go the full width of the page, notice that it just by default it wants to go as wide as possible. But because I specified a width, it's only as wide as it needs to be. Now let's do something interesting here. Let's do this inline. This was the reason I was going to create IDs, but we can just do this inline. And so let's float this left and float this right. And let's see what happens. We can put this there. So the two boxes are floating side by side, correct? So hopefully you can see now we're starting to get into layouts, because you typically wouldn't do site layouts using floats anymore, but I just kind of want to give you the intuition. I've noticed it actually works pretty well because it's a simple technique for the intuition of layouts, putting stuff like side by side. And this makes sense because we've got a 300 by 300 box. We've specified the width and the height. What do you notice about main? So first of all, let me ask, what was the border color for main in our CSS? So box was green. What was it for main? Red. What do you notice about main's box? Not regarding the height. Kind of collapsed, right? And I don't know if it's super obvious, but you can see here the top. And then there's a very small line. It's not going to work if we really zoom in. But hopefully you get the idea. This is actually the box, and what's happened is it's collapsed. The reason is because when you do float, it interrupts the normal document flow, and we've got stuff floating all over the place. Because main is the parent of this, this causes problems for it. So anytime we're done floating, what we have to remember to do is, does anybody remember the name of it? It's called the clear fix hack. Don't know where it got that name, but that's what everyone calls it, so that's what we're going to call it. And then we clear both floats. So this is a relatively simple technique if we want to put things side by side. Okay. Any questions on this? What I think I want to do is leave that at its state, and then I want to take that and copy it to an example 3. So any questions about this before we move on? Pretty straightforward, I think, is that we just had some main, and I'll use terminology. Often we'll call this a container. It just kind of contains things. It doesn't really do anything on its own, but it contains other things. So I'm calling this a container. And then I've got 2 divs that are acting like boxes. Any questions? And then those are floating left and right. Okay. So let's do this. Let's file new, and then let's copy example 2. So I'm doing Control A, but you do Command A, copy, paste, and this will be ex3.html. So you'll notice that because main is block level, it wants to take up the full width of the page. And when we floated those divs left and right side by side, it went to the farthest corner it could. But what if you wanted them kind of centered side by side? So what we can do is we can take main, just like we did here with the boxes, and we can make main fixed width. And let's say each box is going to be 300 pixels. So how wide is the minimum for main? Simple math, just arithmetic. If I've got two boxes and they're 300 pixels each, 600. Now, what I usually do is we have to be careful because a lot of times there are these stray pixels floating around. I don't want to get into it. It has to do with the box model. There's a way to reset it to a certain way. But what I usually do is I just take the number and then add a few pixels. So we might say 615 just to be safe. And now you'll notice that these are actually directly side by side, but it's not in the center of the page. So what we can do is you can kind of think of this as like your frame of reference, is that main contains these things, and these things don't really care where they are. They just know that they're inside of main. So if we were to put it all the way over here or here or here, they would still be left and right from each other, because they just say, I'm inside of main, I'm left and right from each other. Does that make sense? So what we can do is this technique. If we want to center a fixed width div, what we do is we set the margin to auto. And what that does is, remember what margin is. Margin is the stuff, if we go back to our box model, the stuff between our box and the border, which we can't even see because it's 0 pixels, that's the padding. This red right here is the border. But then what's the stuff all around the outside? What's the name for that? That's margin. So what we can do is if we set it to a value called auto, we set margin auto, it tries to evenly distribute the rest of the margin on the left and right. It doesn't really bother with the top and bottom because it's a little bit more complicated for that. So what we can do is we can set inside of main, we can set the margin to auto, and what it'll do is it'll evenly distribute the remaining margin on the left and right hand side. Okay, and then we get, this is our result. So we've got some things centered and then stuff on the left and right. So you can see here, this is kind of the simplest way to do a 2-column design, is you just do a fixed width, whatever. In this case, it's main, but any sort of block level tag is going to work. It's usually going to be main or div or something like that. And then within that, we had two boxes that were fixed width, two divs in this class called box. And then we floated left and right, and then we used that clear fix hack. So any question about this basic technique, because we're going to use this to do something a little bit more involved, but not much. And then this will serve as the basis for your assignment. And I actually want to try to keep today's lecture kind of short, that we have the most amount of time to work on your assignment. Okay, so any questions about this basic technique? Does everyone understand what's going on here? Okay. So let's go ahead and this one's going to be a little bit more involved, so I'm going to try to go slow. Try not to fall behind, but if you do, just raise your hand and I'll stop for a second, because this is going to serve as the basis for your assignment, so it's really important that you have this worked out. Okay, so inside of head. By the way, I always do this because there was a couple lectures in previous semesters where I wasn't really paying attention. I was talking code at the same time. Accidentally put style in the wrong section. So this is like my reminder to make sure to put it inside of head. What we're going to do is create this very generic class. It's going to be called container. And the idea with container is that anytime we need a fixed width, remember before we had main? Anytime we have some sort of fixed width block level tag, very generically called a container, it could be a div, main. We'll actually see a few different ways to use it. Anytime we want something to be contained, we'll put it here. And so what we'll do is we'll say the width is going to be 800 pixels. Because we'll actually have content to put inside of it, we're not going to specify the height. I only specify the height when I absolutely have to. And then usually at some point you want to try to get rid of it. And you want to, there's better ways than specifying height. Anytime we use container, we want it to be in the middle of the page. So we're going to set the margin to auto. And just so what we see we're working with initially, let's go ahead and do that border technique again. But let's do a much smaller border. Sorry, I have to spell correctly. Let's just do 1 pixel this time instead of 5. 5 was a little bit too much. So let's go inside of body here. Actually, let's do this. Before we create header, let's go ahead and put everything inside of main like we did before. Or let's not use main, let's use div. I think div will work better for this example, because we're not going to necessarily put our whole page in here, so it'll make sense once we get going. And this is going to be our container. So we'll say class is equal to container. And then we're going to have a very large banner across the top of our page. We could maybe even use the header class, but I'll just use divs for now. And it's going to say Indian River State College. Now I'm going to want to style this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say class is equal to banner, and then we'll go ahead and create the banner class here in a second. So just taking a step back, all we've done so far is created a container class that has a fixed width margin auto, so it'll sit in the center. And then we used that container, and then we created a banner using a class called banner that we haven't created yet. And then we have Indian River State College. So everyone at that point? Okay. So a common technique for these banners is to do dark background light text. I've noticed that's very common. So let's go ahead and do something like that. And so we'd set our background color, something kind of dark blue like IRC does. See if I can find one that's kind of close. Let's start off with dark blue, see how close that is. Probably not very close, but it's a starting point. So dark background, white text. So we'll say color is, and a lot of times people don't use exactly white. They'll use like some sort of off-white. So maybe ghost white. See how that looks. There's been this trend on the web to not use like black and white. It's like people have reasoning for it, but you've probably noticed more and more grayish text. And there's a whole, if you're interested in Googling it, some people are saying that it's easier to read. Some people say it's not. I don't know if it's actually easier to read or not. Anyway, okay. So we've got a dark background color, light text. And let's set it to a very large font size. Make it bold. And give it some padding. So again, keep on asking yourselves these questions. So I just added padding. Is padding inside the border or outside the border? It's the part inside. So if we run this, you kind of see what's, I'm gonna change it just to a huge value so you see what's going on. Let's say 38. You see what's going on is by setting that padding, what would happen if I had set the margin of this? It would have given me extra stuff outside. Okay, that's not what, and just to show you, this is what it would have done. You see the difference? That's why I chose, does everyone see that? Good, okay. So let me change it back to padding, 8 pixels. Now this is okay, but what I'm noticing more and more sites doing is some variant of, and that's maybe a little bit small. We might want to go with larger font size in a minute, but this works for now. What they'll do is extend the blue background all the way to the edge of the page. Now, this kind of puts us in a weird situation because don't change your code just yet. I might say, okay, let me put it outside of the container. It's the full width, but it's no longer centered. Does everyone know the effect I'm trying to go for? So the background, I want to be the full width, but I just want the text to kind of be in the center container. Not quite centered, but inside the container. Does anybody have any idea how I might be able to accomplish that? So if we flip some things around and say, okay, I want the banner to be on the outside of container because I want the banner, that background color, I want that to be the full width, but the text itself, I want that to be inside of container. This is a very common technique that you'll see, is that you'll have something background-wise be the full width of the page, and then something inside of a container to kind of contain it toward the middle a little bit better. And it's going to be a little bit messy because you can see here we have our border and other stuff's going on, but you get the idea. Now, does anybody see what's going on here? Notice that there's a little bit of extra stuff here. Does anybody know why that is? I don't know if you've discussed this in your other classes. What's that? So what's going on here is by default, some of these elements have some styling by default. You've seen that already with H1. When I use an H1, is it larger or smaller?
Larger.
It's considerably larger than, say, a paragraph. Well, HTML and body are the same way. So what we'll often do is, because that margin and padding just kind of gets in the way, we already can see it's kind of getting in the way here. What we'll do is we'll say HTML body, margin is 0. I could say 0 pixels, same thing. It's just 0 of any unit. And then padding is going to be 0 pixels. These are annoying enough that there's actually CSS libraries out there. There's one that's popular called reset.css. There's quite a few. We'll learn later when we use the Bootstrap framework that a lot of these CSS frameworks already have them included, and so we actually don't have to manually put this very often. But for what we're doing now, because we're working with low-level CSS, we're not using any frameworks or libraries, we have to do this. Now we get, notice that any traces of margin and padding around body are gone. And let's go a little bit larger with this font, I guess. Let's say maybe 40 pixels. Yeah, there we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. So any questions about what we've done so far? The main takeaway is this technique right here of normally you probably think, okay, everything's inside the container, but it's not that simple. Sometimes you want to let some things outside of the container so that they span the full width of the page. Now keep in mind we can use this container multiple times as well. So let's say, for example, we'll use main here. Just check the assignment, see what. Okay. Sorry, I wanted to keep this example as close to the assignment as possible. So we've got our container here, and there's not really anything to see because there's no content inside of it. And let's create a couple of these boxes like we did before. So we'll do that box, the width, and the width we're working here is 800 pixels. So let's do slightly less, let's say 390 pixels. And then set a height of, we'll make them kind of boxy. We'll say 400 pixels. And set a background color so we can see what we're doing. Something light. Okay, so we haven't created our boxes yet. Let's go ahead and put a couple of boxes inside of main, and we'll just stick to div this time. So we'll have 2 boxes, and then we'll just make them float left and right. And at this point, I think that red border has probably outlived its usefulness. It served as a good initial guide, but it's just kind of getting in the way now, so let's go ahead and get rid of that inside of a container. It's not really helping us at this point. Okay, so this is a good checkpoint. So first of all, this is basically what your site should look like, or your page, is that we've got this banner, and it's aligned because it's inside of the container. And this is nice because now anytime we put content inside of here, like 2-column content, it's aligned here. Okay. Is everyone good so far? Do you need to scroll to a specific area of code? Okay, and does anybody need any section explained? Okay. So let's do this. We've got our banner. We've got our other container here. Let's do this. So I don't really like Indian River State College just hanging out there by itself. Let's go ahead and put it in H1 is probably appropriate. Maybe not so. It's not perfect. Let's say a paragraph for now. We'll come back to this later. We'll fix up some things later. I just wanted to put in a paragraph for just for now. Actually, let's do this. Canceling that. We'll just leave it by itself. I don't. And then we'll put our navigation outside of the banner. Navigation inside of an unordered list. And let's say we'll be very generic. We've got 4 links. I won't even bother to put making them an ahref. Let's just be kind of lazy about it. Link 1, 2, 3, 4. We're probably going to do some styling with this. So I'm going to say class is equal to primary-nav. Now, quick question. I chose the name primary nav. Some people might have chosen top nav because it's going to be at the top of the page. Why do you think I chose the name primary instead of top? Exactly, it might not always be on the top, and then that becomes kind of a silly name. But as long as it still serves as my primary navigation, doesn't matter if it's on the top or the left or wherever I decide to put it. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that and run it. So it's not great. It's like HTML-wise, it's proper, but we got to style this a little bit because right now the styling isn't really. First of all, it's vertical. It'd be nice if we can get this horizontal. We have other things like these bullets here. Let's go ahead and create our class and start to knock these out one at a time. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky because we don't want to style this. We want to style the unordered list. Now we could give the UL its own class name, primary nav UL or something like that. But we can actually use these selectors to say within the primary nav class, if you see an unordered list, apply this style just to the unordered list. So we're not applying it here to the nav. We're saying, okay, if you see the primary nav class, go here inside of this unordered list. Does everyone see that? Okay. How many people have seen that technique before, where you have the class name and then something? Okay. But that makes at least intuitive sense what's going on, correct? Because we'll probably use this technique, not a whole lot, but every once in a while, where I want to style this thing, not really this. If we styled this, it's not going to really do anything because this is what's causing all the problems. This is what puts the bullet points and it puts it vertical and all that. So if we style this, it's not going to really have any effect. But this is kind of the appropriate name for it because this is the nav. This is the unordered list within the nav, so we can use this. Okay, so let's the easiest is to get rid of those bullet points. So let's say list style type, set that to none. So you can see the bullets have been removed. But there's another issue that's maybe not super clear inside of brackets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up. Well, two things. Let's fix this easier one first. So right now it's not inside the container. To me, it makes sense to put it inside of the container. So let's go ahead and also do that. So what we'll do is we could surround this with a div, but to me, this is probably okay to put inside the container. So we're going to apply both the primary nav and the container. So this is going to serve as both. Just make sure it's going to display. Yeah, okay. So we can actually apply multiple classes. We can say, okay, this is going to be the primary nav and the container. And then it goes through that cascading process that we've talked about a little bit. This actually works pretty well because containers mostly having to do with like width and centering. And right now, primary nav, so far, it's just like stylistic things like getting rid of the bullet. But so this right here, this is the alignment where container is. You see kind of the light blue and where Indian River State College on the left. What do you notice about the links? Are they lined up with that? No. And again, this is one of the super annoying things about HTML is that by default, it wants to have a lot of implicit styles applied to it. So if I go over here and I go, so I guess I can hover over here. So do you see that box on the kind of near the bottom right where it's like different colors? It's like green and blue and so on. So what does the blue represent? Perfect. Blue is content. And then that outer kind of, I don't know how you describe it, orangish, kind of brownish color, that's margin. And then border, we don't have any border. Well, what's green? Padding. What do you notice as I hover over this? Yeah, it had some implicit padding. And that makes sense, I guess, if you have a list, is that you don't want it to be everything all flushed up against the, but we want to kind of reset it. We want to get rid of a lot of these things that are annoying. So what we're going to do here is, knowing that we have padding, we can go back in here. And say, I don't want any padding on that left-hand side. So I can say padding left 0 pixels. And before I reload, just to be clear, notice that if, I know it's not super visible because the fonts are kind of small, but I'm hovering over this and it says LI for list item. And the reason I knew that it belonged to UL is because when I went over here, as I hovered, it said, okay, now you're looking at UL. Does everyone see that? I know it's kind of tough to see, but here I'm hovering over the list items and I'm not seeing any padding for list items, but as soon as I go to that UL, I say, okay, I see what's going on here. UL inherited some padding. Okay, it actually inherited 40 pixels, which is a pretty large amount. So now we change it, and now we can see here it's all lined up. So we're getting somewhere, but we're not exactly quite to where we want to be. Now here I'm going to do a little bit of hand waving and magic and kind of just write some code. This is going to introduce something called Flexbox, which I would like to start talking about next class. Unfortunately, if it's complex enough that it takes probably a good lecture or two to explain. It's very, very powerful, and it's really interesting. Now, to just use it for this one example, the code is actually not that complicated. So if I want to take this code from being vertical to horizontal, what I'll do is I'll set the display property to flex, saying that I want it to be Flexbox. Now we're sort of almost there, but the links are kind of all squished together. Maybe you could do some stuff with margins, or the alternative would be to space it completely evenly across the whole container. So let's try that. So we'll do this property called justify content. We have two options, space around and space between. Let's start off with space between. I'll show you both, and then you can use either on your assignment. You see what's going on here is that it took that list, and by default, Flex wants to go along the horizontal axis. And then it has this property called justify content that we can spread it out however we want to. The other alternative is space around. For your assignment, I don't really care which you use. And the idea is, notice what you get is like a half a unit on the left and right, extra space. So it's a preference thing, either one. For this, space between might make more sense. And it might look a little bit better if you add a couple more links, make them like more realistic links, but you get the idea. Okay. I think that's really all I want to go over. Does anybody have any questions on this? Yes. We'll have a break. So you're saying with your individual code? Yeah. I'll take a look at it in a minute. Okay. So let's do this. Like I said, I don't want this to go too long. It's been a little over an hour. The high-level view of your assignment is I want you to take this, and again, this is kind of the introduction to layouts. I think for many people, this is like the first time you actually start doing more sophisticated layouts than just everything, going from top to bottom. Maybe some of you, had any of you done Float before? Okay. Float's not a super great technique because you can already see here, Flexbox, it's much, much more powerful. It's just more complicated. So it's like one of those things that's going to take us a couple classes to learn. Flexbox for two-column layout, I mean, you don't get much simpler than float left, float right, clear it, but it's got limitations. It wasn't really meant for that. It's really meant more for that first example that we did where you want to wrap some text around an image. That's where it kind of is more practical. Okay. So what you're going to do for your assignment is take that example as your starting point and this should be obvious, but I would suggest for most people is don't just start modifying example 4. Take it and maybe just A2 for assignment 2. Okay, that way you can always go back to your original. It seems obvious, but I've had people, you know, do that in the past. So you're gonna take this and you're gonna kind of fill it with content. So these boxes here, you might fill it with an image and some text, or I'm gonna leave it up to you. Okay, but the basic idea is to fill this with content, and then you have to add a couple things as well. Let's do this. I'm gonna edit this. We didn't do the full page background color. It's kind of, I don't even really like that technique anymore. You don't see it around, so I'm gonna get rid of that. We'll say the X's. Does anybody remember the property for rounded corners? Doesn't have to be a hard, like something super large, just a little bit, just so I know how to use it. So the property is called border radius. And what that does is it makes it so that you can actually round the corners a little bit. So you'll have a banner with your site's name like we just did, a simple navigation, and then you're going to have to add the footer tag, and the footer needs to line up. Okay, so I don't want to see like your footer all the way, you know, some random place. The idea is that your footer is supposed to line up and use the same basic technique of background, that's the full width, and then some text. You can make it say something as simple as copyright 2020 if you want. Okay, now some of you may get, by default, it's going to be a little bit frustrating because your footer is going to be right here. Now, some of you may get more advanced, and I'll just let you know the terminology. If you want it to go all the way to the bottom, you're going to be looking for what's called a sticky footer. There's two techniques that are similar, sticky footer or fixed footer. Either one, if you Google it, it looks a little bit nicer, but I'm not going to make you do that. Okay, so everyone gets the basic idea is that this is going to be your starting point, and you just have to take this basic layout and start to fill it with content. It doesn't have to be anything super crazy. It can be lorem ipsum if you want, and lorem pixel for the images. That's fine with me, but just start to fill it up a little bit. Maybe put some, instead of link 1 through 4, some other link names. This is just to get you used to the working inside of that code and the layouts and stuff. Okay. So any questions on it? Don't just modify one thing and turn it in. Go to a little bit of effort because you have a pretty good amount of time in this class. And because this is a relatively simple assignment, I'm going to make this due next class. And then once we get in next class, we're going to talk about Flexbox, which is it's a super, super useful technique. It's got a little bit of a steep learning curve. But once you learn it, it's very, very powerful. As we saw with just a couple lines of code, doing something like this years ago would have been very, very, very difficult. With Flexbox, it's amazingly simple. Okay. So let's do this. Let's take about a 10-minute break. And get up, roam around, do whatever. I'm going to stop recording here.